Hello, this is a presentation on the analysis of Florida school districts, where we will dive into some key metrics associated with the operation and performance. My name is Carrie Allen, and this is my final project for ACG6177 Accounting Data Analytics. For this analysis, I gathered data from the Florida Department of Education's website. The FLDOE provides a plethora of different data records, spanning from financial information, FTE history, district and school grade history, staff salary information, and much, much more. This data can be reported at the school district level or the school-based level. For this analysis, I focused on the school years 2017 to 2018 through 2021-2022 school years. The main period analyzed was the 18-19 school year. This was due to some timing issues across all the different data sets and the COVID-19 pandemic. A level overview of my findings from this analysis indicated that of the 67 school districts in Florida, all earned a grade performance of C or better, with nearly 81% being a grade of B or higher. The letter grade of the school district could be found in any school size district, regardless of whether it was a school district with a lot of students or a school district with very few students. Any letter grade was possible. One district did stand out. That would be Monroe District during this time frame. They had the highest expenditure per pupil as well as revenue per pupil. However, when analyzing their year-over-year trends, their population remained flat. The average number of students in a district can predict the amount of average expenditures per pupil for that district, as well as the average total expenditure per pupil in a district could predict the average revenue as well. The motivation behind this analysis is to analyze the attributes of Florida school districts and see how they may impact each other. The stakeholders involved with this type of analysis could be anywhere from a school-based or district-based faculty and staff member, all the way up to the state-level educational leaders, as well as parents of the students within these districts. The objectives of this analysis is to use historical data from the Florida Department of Education, both financial and non-financial, to investigate patterns, anomalies, and determine if the district's performance is dependent on the number of students, the amount of revenue, or the amount of expenditures incurred. To start off this analysis, I developed several descriptive questions. First, I want to look at the average expenditure and average revenue per pupil of each of the districts, focusing on those that fall in the top 5. I also want to see how all the districts land when it comes to their grade performance. I want to be able to identify the minimum and maximum dollar amount for the Florida school districts, as well as what the name of those districts are that fall as the minimum and maximum. To further this analysis, I developed some diagnostic questions. Looking at the highest and lowest expenditure per pupil districts, I want to see how the spread of their grade performance is based on their expenditure amounts. Then, with the identification of the maximum and minimum districts, I would like to look at a year-over-year comparison at their number of students and total expenditure per pupil to see if there's any kind of trend over the years that might explain the reason for being a maximum and the minimum in those areas. Finally, I developed some predictive questions to see if one metric of the district can help predict a different metric from the district. So looking at the expenditure per pupil, and if the minimum district had an increase, to see whether that had an impact on the average revenue per pupil for that district. Also, looking at the maximum average total students per district and seeing if there was a decrease in their student population, what would the average total cost per student be in that scenario? As I worked through the planning stage of this analysis, I went to the Florida Department of Education website to gather school and district grade level achievement information. The overall time span for this information is 5 years, although due to the COVID pandemic, the school grades for school year 1920 were suspended, so they weren't reported at all. And then for 2021, they were optional, so the points information that schools earned is available for all, but not all school districts had a letter grade assigned. Each of these data sets contained various numbers of rows and columns to assist in developing my analysis. I also went to the financial portion of the FLDOE website to gather expenditure and revenue information for the districts. Depending on the data set, some were reported at the school-based level, like the expenditure files, or they were reported at the district level, like the revenue files. If this occurred, then some transformation of the data was required in order to have the information report equivalent data. The final piece that I gathered from this section was the FTE count for the schools, which provided 5 years of student enrollment history across the districts. Included here is a data dictionary for this analysis. Most of the attribute labels are self-explanatory. However, I will highlight Key 1 and Key 2. Key 1 is a unique numerical code created from the district number, and school year from the datasets. Key 2 is also a unique numerical code that was created from just the district number and school number from the datasets. These keys were both used in order to link the sets during the analysis. The analysis techniques I incorporated for this project involved taking the various data sets obtained from the FLDOE website and combined the same characteristics over the different years into one spreadsheet. Then I had to create individual keys in order to link those different data sets together. For the revenue portion of the analysis, this data came at the district level only. Therefore, I had to create 2 new columns on that spreadsheet in order to report the total number of students for that district, and then to calculate what would be the average revenue per student based on their total revenue and total student population. There were some data and analysis risks and controls that needed to be incorporated during this analysis. Some of the risks include data manipulation. Since I was combining multiple years of the same data set, it is possible to have overwritten some of the rows. Data errors, such as missing data between the different data sets. Technology errors, since I was using relatively new programs to perform this analysis. And calculation errors when converting district data to school-based data, or taking school-based data and converting it up to a district-level data. To control for these, while manipulating the data to combine the multiple years, I ensured that I compared the source data to the combined file so that all rows were accounted for. During any calculations, I verified the calculations to make sure that there were no errors. And finally, I worked on building my skills with the new technology so that I could perform appropriate analysis. And now we will review the analysis and interpretation portion of this presentation. I did combine these 2 sections, so each slide will contain the question being investigated, the visual of the analysis performed for that question, and a reporting of the findings from that analysis. Initially, I created a bar chart of all school districts to see the ranking for both revenues and expenditures per pupil for the total 67 school districts. The top bar chart is for the revenue, and we can see that the top 5 highest revenue per pupil school districts are Monroe, Liberty, Gulf, Collier, and Walton, ranging from $52,000 per pupil down to $36,000 per pupil in revenue. For the expense bar chart below, we can see that the top 5 school districts that had the highest expenditures were Monroe, Jefferson, Glades, Franklin, and Santa Rosa, ranging from $21,000 per pupil down to $15,000 per pupil in expenses. Following that analysis, I wanted to plot out the 67 school districts in Florida and see how they fell within the different grading scales. My first analysis, a pie chart, shows how many schools fall within the A, B, C, D, or F range. We can easily see that no district fell in a D or F range in the 2018-2019 school year. We can then filter on each of the grade levels that the districts have earned to see which ones fell in that category and how much their overall expenditures appear to be within that district and how many students those districts had that earned those grade levels. This example is for all of those districts that earned an A during the 2018-2019 school year. Next, we can click on the B range in the pie chart, and the images would all change to show what the distribution of total expenses per pupil look for those districts that earn Bs, as well as how many students go to those districts that earn the B grade level during that school year. And finally, we can click on the C pie slice to see the same distribution as far as how the average total cost per district fell for those with a C and the range of student population for the schools that were within the C range as well. Once I had a spread of all the districts, I was interested in which ones may be the minimum or the maximum regarding expenses and revenues, what those dollar amounts would entail, and which district names would fall into that area. From there, I created 2 different box and whisker visualizations to be able to see where the districts fell. When it came to the average revenue per pupil, it turned out that Monroe had the largest in the 2018-2019 school year of over $52,000 per student, where Clay County was the lowest of revenue received per pupil at just over $19,000. Where when we look at the expenses side, in the average expenses per pupil, Monroe again fell into the highest amount at just shy of $21,000 for each student, and Suwannee was the lowest in the 2018-2019 school year with about $7,400 per student. Now that I identified the minimum and maximum expenditure per pupil districts, I wanted to graph a year-over-year change to see if there was any explanation for why these districts fell in the maximum and minimum categories. In looking at Monroe over the course of the 4 years, their revenues increased dramatically from the 17-18 through the 19-20 school year, although had a pretty good drop in the 2021 school year. But for all 4 of those school years, their student population remained relatively flat. However, for Suwannee, looking at all 4 school years, both in the total expenses and the number of students each of those years, both remained relatively flat, not really indicating any major spike or any major dip in either of those 2 metrics for the district. Then I wanted to look at all of the districts and their grade performance and see if those that had the highest expenditure equated to districts that also had very high grade performances. To narrow the overall search, I looked at the top 5 districts with the highest expenditures. And in looking at those, we can see that 2 of those districts earned A's, where the other 3 earned C's. I also wanted to look at this analysis for the lowest expenditure per pupil districts. And again, focusing on the bottom 5 school districts to see whether they would all have earned C's or lower for grade performance. We can see here in this image that the bottom 5 school districts all earned grades of A or B for their grade performance. Next, I took the average number of students by district and the average total expenditure per pupil by district and developed a scatter plot with a trend line of those data points. I did exclude one county, Monroe, as it appeared to be an outlier compared to all of the other districts during the 2018-2019 school year. In looking at the trend line data, the p-value does end up being a 0.01 value, which is less than the 0.05 significance level, indicating that this equation would be a good indicator to predict future trends. Therefore, I took the maximum average total student district, which is Flagler, at 1,082 students, and calculated if they had a 20% increase for next school year. And inputting that data into this trend line, the findings are that Flagler would experience an increase in their total expenditure per pupil of $2,101. Took the average revenue per pupil and the average expenditure per pupil by district for the 2018-2019 school year and developed a scatter plot and a trend line for that data as well. In looking at the trend line information, the p-value for this equation also falls well below the 0.5 significance level, indicating that this model would be a good indicator to predict future trends. Therefore, I took the district with the minimum expenditure per pupil, which is Shawnee at $7,464, and calculated a 10% increase for that district. Then, plotting all those amounts into the equation, I was able to calculate that with a 10% increase in expenditure per pupil, Shawnee would expect to have an increase in revenue per pupil of $841. With this analysis, I was able to determine of the 67 school districts in Florida, all of them earn at least a grade performance of C or better during the 2018-2019 school year. The overall spread of that performance varied regarding the number of students, expenses, and revenues, and no one category really stood out as an indicator for the other in that regard. However, the average number of students per district can predict the average total expenditure per pupil, and the average total expenditure per pupil can predict the average total revenue per pupil. The remaining 4 slides list where each of the data sets were found on the Florida Department of Education's website. This is the end of the analysis of the Florida School District presentation.